I'm so excited to share with you the Sewing Box brand new subscription. This is a once monthly package curated by April herself, specifically for quilters looking to build their stash. I love products like this because it introduces me to designers that I normally wouldn't reach for and challenges my creativity. Every month you get a Villa Rosa Designs pattern, which you know are my favorite, an exclusive sticker, and 4 fat quarters. And just look at how fun and vibrant these are. You're guaranteed to never get a repeat, and all of the fabrics are quilt shop quality and by some of the best designers. All for under $20 a month. I can't wait to get these fabrics under my machine and see what I can come up with. Follow to see what I make, and I've posted the link if you're interested in getting your own subscription package. I need 40 half square triangles for this quilt, so I'm going to make them 4 at a time. I lay my 2 squares of fabric right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance around all 4 sides. Then I cut diagonally across the block from one corner to the next in both directions. This will give me 4 perfect half square triangles. However, because we're cutting on this diagonal line, the edges of these triangles are biased, meaning they stretch a little bit more than if they were straight of grain. So just be extra careful with these squares until you get them attached to another piece of fabric. After ironing all of my half square triangles, I like to work a couple rows at a time, lay out my squares, and take them over to the sewing machine to attach. I head back to the ironing board every row to make sure that my seams lay nice and flat. I originally pulled this fabric from my stash to use for a border for this quilt, but then I realized that I have enough of this to use as the backing, and I think that this would be an awesome backing. So I picked out this pink and purple to use for the border instead. It really matches well with a lot of the things that the gorillas are wearing. You know that I hate pinning, but I always take the time to pin my borders. This prevents accidentally stretching the quilt top or the border and makes sure that you don't have any extra fullness in the quilt top or the borders when you go to baste and quilt. And once again, I'm going to take the time to iron this nice and flat. Now this quilt top is done being assembled, and I just have to get it loaded onto the long arm, quilted, and bound. And then we'll have a finished quilt. I have the gorilla quilt loaded onto my long arm, and I've basted down the top and side edges. I grabbed a few different thread choices and picked out my favorite one. Now I'm letting my machine know where on the frame the quilt is. And I'm also going to enter how big it is so that the machine knows where to stitch. I picked out this fun angular quilting design, then resized it so it's the size I want the design to be. And I repeated the design so it fills the entire quilt area. Next, I cropped out anything that is outside of the quilt area. And now this is ready to stitch out on the quilt. Because this is such a small quilt and I picked a less dense design, this should be a pretty quick process. Here I'm already started on the second row, and you can see I advanced the quilt up on the machine so it can reach the next section. And the quilting is done. It's time to trim up my quilt, make sure my squares are square and my edges are nice and straight. I'm using this large square ruler and lining up the lines on the ruler with the seams from my borders. Then I'll use my rotary cutter with a nice sharp blade to trim off the excess backing and batting. For the long sides, I switched to my longer ruler to make the process go a little bit quicker, going back to my square ruler for each corner to make sure that they're the perfect 90-degree angle. Once this is done, all that's left to do is bind our quilt, and it will be ready to use. It's time to make the binding strips for our gorilla quilt. I used excess scraps of my backing and cut them to 2.5 inches wide. Then I lay the strips right sides together at a 90-degree angle and sew from one corner diagonally to the other corner. And I chain piece all of these through my machine at once. Using this diagonal seam reduces the bulk that you're sewing through when you're attaching the binding onto your quilt. It can also make the joins a little less noticeable in the final quilt. Then I take the strip over to my ironing board, separate the pieces, and cut off the excess fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, I press each of these joins so that the seams lay nice and flat. You could press your seams open, that would be a great choice here, but I just press them to the side. Once all of my joins are pressed, I fold my binding strip in half, lining up the raw edges, and give it another press. It's time to finish off our gorilla quilt by adding our binding. I cut these binding strips to 2.5 inches wide and folded them in half. Now I'm leaving about a 6-inch tail and lining the raw edges of my binding strip with the raw edges of my quilt. I'm stitching this on with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I did stitch a couple stitches in reverse at the beginning to lock my stitches into place. When I get down to my first corner, I'm stopping about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my quilt, turning my entire quilt and sewing straight off the corner. Then I'll turn my quilt sideways, fold my binding strip straight up to get that nice 45-degree angle, and then down over itself again. Then I'll continue stitching down the next side of my quilt, again stitching in reverse for a few stitches to lock my stitches into place. This is also where I take the time to stick my label onto my quilt. And I'm starting with the back side of my quilt because I'm going to be finishing this completely by machine. I've attached my binding strip all the way around the back side of my quilt, and I'm back to where I started. I need to attach these two ends. I'm going to overlap these ends by the same width of my original binding strips, which is 2.5 inches. I'm using an extra scrap of binding to measure this out, but you can use a ruler. Then I take the bottom strip, unfold it, and lay it right sides up. Unfold the top strip and lay it right sides down and place them together at a 90-degree angle. Then I stitch these together diagonally from one corner to the other. Using this diagonal seam reduces bulk in the final binding and also makes the joins a little less noticeable to the eye. After attaching my ends, I always give it a little tug to make sure I did it right before trimming off my excess fabric. Then I can finish attaching this to the back side of my quilt before flipping it to the front side and finishing 100% by machine. If you wanted to finish your binding by hand, you might want to attach it to the front side by machine and then the back side by hand. Now that I've attached my binding all the way around the back side of my quilt, I'm going to move my sewing machine needle all the way over to the left and wrap my needle around to the front side of the quilt. Next, I'm going to stitch this down as close to the fold of the binding as possible. When I get down to the first corner, I'm going to fold the bottom up first and then the side over to create that nice 45-degree angle. Then I lift my presser foot and turn my quilt to start working down the next side. I like to finish most of my bindings 100% by machine, so that's why I attach it to the back side first and then the front side. This gives me a little bit more control over where this line of stitching ends up on the front of my quilt. Using that technique, you will still see a line of stitching on the binding on your front and on your backing on the back, but I just make sure I use a nice blending thread color so it's not as noticeable. And I definitely don't mind seeing those stitches because it means I saved hours of hand stitching.